It began with a sentence buried deep inside a classified cable, just one line. Yet it carried the weight of centuries. Deliver 60% of your oil and gold within 48 hours, or face consequences. At the bottom of that ultimatum stood the signature of Donald J. Trump, then President of the United States. It was not diplomacy. It was not negotiation. It was empire in a suit, demanding Africa's soul once again. But history does not always repeat itself. Sometimes it is interrupted. On the other side of that demand sat a 35-year-old captain, Ibrahim Traoré, a man forged not in boardrooms but on the red soil of Burkina Faso. They expected him to bend. Instead, he stood taller. He read the letter once, then twice, and calmly declared, Burkina Faso is not for sale. This story is not just about gold or oil. It is about African sovereignty tested at the Sahel crossroads. It is about one soldier who dared to answer empire with defiance, and a continent that held its breath to see if he would survive. Stay with us because this isn't just another story. It's the future our ancestors dreamed of. Subscribe and walk with us for an Africa that never bows again. It began like a whisper carried across the corridors of power, a leaked document, a confidential cable, and a demand so bold it stunned even Washington's own insiders. Buried within its pages was a line that could change the destiny of an entire nation. Burkina Faso must deliver 60% of its oil and gold within 48 hours, or face consequences. This was no rumor, no speculation. At the bottom of that threat was the unmistakable signature of Donald J. Trump, the man who once claimed to lead the free world. But this was not freedom. It was shackles dressed in polite language. The so-called Strategic Resource Acquisition Framework laid it out coldly. United States oil giants would claim majority control of Burkina Faso's oil production. All major gold exports would pass through American-approved channels. An advisory committee of U.S. representatives would oversee new contracts and dictate how revenues should be spent. In exchange, promises of security cooperation and, hidden between the lines, protection from regime change. It was a deal carved not from partnership but from fear. To accept it would be to kneel before empire imperialism. Too, Ling, history trembled in that moment, because this was not the first time Africa had heard such words. For centuries, men in powdered wigs, in military uniforms, in modern suits, and had come to the continent with the same message. Your land is ours. Your wealth is ours. Your children's future is ours. From the days when European ships dragged human cargo across the Atlantic, to the age when colonial armies carved up borders with ink and blood, to the era when international banks enslaved nations with debt, the script had remained the same. And now, in the 21st century, the script returned. This time with the American president's name at the bottom, inside Ouagadougou. In the war room of the presidency, the atmosphere was heavy. Generals exchanged glances. Ministers shifted nervously. The ultimatum gave them only 48 hours to decide whether their country would stand free or fall silent under the weight of foreign control. The pressure was immense, and the consequences loomed like storm clouds over the Sahel. Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat quietly as the letter was read aloud. Twice he listened. Twice he allowed the weight of those words to settle over the room. Then, in a tone so steady it cut through the fear, he whispered, "So this is their price for peace. Slavery in a suit and tie." Those words echoed across the chamber. They were more than defiance. They were a reminder that Burkina Faso carried scars of betrayal and resistance. Of Thomas Sankara, who once stood in that same land and declared that dignity was worth more than diamonds. Sankara's ghost lingered in that room, as if history itself was waiting for a new chapter to be written, and Traoré was ready to write it. For too long, foreign companies had drilled Africa's oil and dug Africa's gold, exporting the profits while leaving behind broken roads, broken promises, and broken people. For too long, Leaders had been told to accept crumbs from the tables of the powerful, but on this day, the calculus shifted. The ultimatum was supposed to break him. Instead, it revealed the truth that Burkina Faso stood at the crossroads of history, the Sahel crossroads, and one soldier's decision could redraw the map of African sovereignty. As the sun set that evening, the nation held its breath. 48 hours remained on Washington's clock, but for Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the countdown was not to submission, it was to resistance, because when empire knocks demanding 60%, Africa must decide, will we surrender one more generation, or will we finally say no? The letter lay unopened on his desk for the last time. The weight of it could have crushed lesser men. But Ibrahim Traoré was not a man trained to bow. He was a soldier forged in fire, a son of the Sahel, and now the president of a nation that had bled for too long. He summoned his intelligence chief, his military commander, and his closest advisors. With steady voice, he gave his order: tell the Americans, Burkina Faso is not for sale. By noon, the nation was waiting. Radios fell silent. Televisions flickered to life. And every household leaned closer as the screen turned black, then opened on the figure of Captain Traoré. No golden curtains, no polished studio, just a man in uniform. One hand on the Burkina Faso flag, the other resting on a folder marked Confidential U.S. Threat. His voice was measured, calm, and unshaken. To the people of Burkina Faso, and to our African brothers and sisters, he began. An offer has been made to sell our oil, to sell our gold, to sell our honor in exchange for fear. He paused, and the silence across the country was so deep it felt like the ancestors were listening. Then came the words that set fire to a continent: to Mr. Trump and his backers, you have misjudged us. We are not Libya. We are not Iraq. We are not your playground. We will never trade our land for your luxury. We will never bow to your bullets or your banks. You gave us 48 hours. Here is our reply. You now have 48 hours to take your greed, your threats, and your arrogance off African soil. The speech, the Ibrahim Traoré speech that would be replayed across Africa, was more than a rejection. It was a declaration. A young captain, barely 35, was staring down an empire and saying no. For many, it was the echo of Thomas Sankara's defiance decades earlier. The spirit of resistance reborn. Commentators called it rash, dangerous, even suicidal. But in the streets of Ouagadougou, people poured out with drums, firecrackers, and chants. They shouted his name, not just as a president, but as a symbol. Across the continent, the reaction was electric. In Bamako, murals appeared overnight. Traoré standing on an oil barrel, the Burkinabe flag waving high. In Kinshasa, crowds chanted his words back to the West: we are not your playground. Hashtags surged. Number Africa is not for sale. Burkina Faso rises. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, from Harlem to Havana. People saw in his defiance not just politics, but prophecy, and he was not standing alone. Days later, 3 military planes landed quietly in Ouagadougou. No diplomats, no entourages, just 3 men who understood what was at stake. From Mali came Colonel Assimi Goïta, steady and silent. From Niger, General Abdourahmane Tiani, eyes burning with resolve. From Guinea, Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya, tall and unflinching. They walked into the palace beside Traoré. And when they emerged, the world heard a new doctrine: if you touch Burkina Faso, you touch all of us. It was not a treaty. It was not a policy paper drafted in Paris or Washington. It was a brotherhood born in betrayal and war. It was the alliance of Sahel states, AES, taking its first public stand as Africa's shield. Mali sent hardened fighters to guard the oil fields. Niger supplied logistics to patrol the desert routes. Guinea opened its airspace for emergency supply lines. The message was unmistakable. This was not just Burkina Faso's fight, it was a continental stand for African sovereignty. In that moment, Pan-Africanism was no longer a slogan. It was a shield of flesh and blood, and at its center stood a soldier who refused to kneel. The ultimatum had been issued, the empire had made its threat, but now, Africa had spoken back. The question that lingered in every heart was simple. Would the world allow one soldier's defiance to ignite a new fire of freedom, or would they crush it before it could spread? Empires rarely accept no as an answer. Within hours of President Ibrahim Traoré's defiant speech, the machinery of the West roared into motion, not with tanks on the ground, not yet, but with words, pixels, and shadows. On CNN, talking heads warned that Burkina Faso was spiraling into chaos under an unstable young soldier. The BBC ran reports predicting famine and mass displacement. French newspapers printed headlines that screamed about a new dictator in the Sahel. The smear campaign was swift, synchronized, and ruthless. They did not debate his arguments, they attacked his character. Traoré, they said, was erratic, paranoid, even mentally unfit. But in Ouagadougou, the people laughed. University students gathered in lecture halls, not to cower, but to hold teach-ins on sovereignty and resource justice. Women's groups delivered food and supplies to soldiers guarding the mines, declaring that their sons and brothers would not stand alone. Across the country, young people reposted Western headlines with captions like, "If they hate him this much, he must be doing something right." Still, the shadow war deepened. CIA drones flew tighter over the Sahel crossroads, watching every convoy, mapping every oil field. Private contractors, men without flags, but with heavy weapons, were spotted near the Ghana border. Online, bot armies flooded social media with fake scandals about President Ibrahim Traoré, hoping to fracture his support. The tactic was old: destabilize from within, make the people doubt their leader. Yet the effect was the opposite. The more they attacked, the stronger the resistance grew. In Bamako, murals of Traoré were painted with the words, "Africa is not your minefield." In Conakry, hip-hop artists turned his speech into protest songs played on every street corner. In Lagos, crowds outside the U.S. embassy chanted, "Keep your democracy, we'll keep our dignity." And across the ocean, the African diaspora heard the call. In Harlem, elders nodded as they watched the Ibrahim Traoré speech replayed online, remembering the fire of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. In Atlanta, a pastor told his congregation, "That young man is standing where Sankara once stood. He is saying what we once dreamed: Africa belongs to Africans." On Instagram and YouTube, African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans amplified the message, declaring, "This man just told Trump, 'Over my dead body.' That's leadership. Pay attention." The contrast could not have been sharper. Western media painted a picture of collapse. African voices painted a portrait of pride. One side cried danger. The other saw dignity. But make no mistake, the empire was not retreating. The disinformation war was only the beginning. Behind closed doors in Washington and Paris, and strategies were drawn to squeeze Burkina Faso through sanctions, blockades, and covert pressure. Gold routes were monitored, bank accounts frozen. Whispers of regime change began to circulate again. Still, the people stood firm. And this time, the resistance was not just political or military. It was cultural, spiritual, almost sacred. In villages, griots, the storytellers, recited the defiance of Traoré alongside the legends of past heroes. In cities, youth wore shirts declaring Africa is not for sale. Even the elders, long accustomed to disappointment, spoke with new fire. "This boy carries Sankara's spirit. We must not let them break him." This was the empire's miscalculation. They thought they were fighting one man, but when Captain Ibrahim Traoré said no, millions whispered no with him. The fight was no longer about one soldier or one country. It was about a continent refusing to kneel. And so the question shifted: could propaganda, drones, and sanctions silence an idea that had already been set free? Or was Africa, for the first time in generations, ready to write its own headline? While Washington fumed and Paris whispered of sanctions, two other powers watched the storm in silence. They did not send ultimatums. They did not threaten regime change. They sent engineers, crates, and quiet words that carried far more weight than bluster. You are not alone. 72 hours after Trump's demand lit up the world, a Chinese delegation landed in Ouagadougou. No cameras, no press, no pomp. Just engineers, trade officials, and a plan. Within 90 days, they promised, Burkina Faso could have its own oil refinery designed, built, and operated without Western oversight. Alongside it came a gold valuation system that bypassed the monopoly of Western banks and a digital trade network powered by China's digital yuan. For the first time, Burkina Faso could sell oil and gold without touching the U.S. dollar or the CFA franc. For the first time, the nation could hold its wealth in its own hands. The very next day, a Russian military transport descended onto a secure runway. Inside, advanced electronic warfare systems, anti-drone shields, and crates marked simply specialized defense assets. Translation: the oil fields of Burkina Faso were now guarded by Russian-grade defenses capable of neutralizing surveillance and protecting convoys from sabotage. With them came military advisors, hardened by Syria and Donbass men who understood hybrid war and were ready to train local forces. To the west, it was a dangerous new axis. To Africa, it was survival. Traoré was not surrendering to Moscow or Beijing. He was choosing tools, not masters. In his own words, we are not exchanging one empire for another. We are choosing to stand, and we welcome any hand that helps us remain standing. Meanwhile, the alliance of Sahel states Mali, Niger, and Guinea acted as Africa's living shield. Mali sent fighters to guard oil pipelines. Niger dispatched logistics convoy across treacherous desert terrain. Guinea opened its airspace for supply flights. AES did not draft long documents. They acted with boots, fuel, and solidarity. Their statement was clear: if you strike Burkina Faso, you strike us all. For many, this was the first true glimpse of Pan-Africanism in practice, not just speeches at summits, but armies, engineers, and communities working as one. It was Africa's NATO, born not of Western sponsorship, but of African necessity. The symbolism cut deeper than any weapon. For centuries, African nations had been told they could not build, defend, or trade without foreign guardians. Yet here was a soldier president declaring the opposite. Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traoré does not need permission to be free. And here were partners China, Russia, AES, proving that the old dependency model could be broken. Western media howled. Analysts cried that Traoré had sold out to dictatorships. But in Bamako, Dakar, Nairobi, and even in the diaspora communities of New York and London, people saw something different. A young leader refusing to bow, a continent daring to imagine sovereignty. And so, while the empire sharpened its knives, a new question took root across Africa. If one of the smallest nations of the Sahel Crossroads could reject America's ultimatum and still stand, what excuse did the others have for silence? Perhaps the most powerful image of that week was not a tank or a flag, but a handshake Traoré standing beside Russian officers and Chinese engineers. With AES commanders at his back, it was messy, imperfect, and fraught with risk. But it was also something Africa had not seen in generations: a nation choosing its allies on its own terms. This was not submission. This was strategy. This was survival. And above all, this was sovereignty, African sovereignty, written in bold ink across the red earth of Burkina Faso. The deadline had come and gone. Washington's 48 hours expired. But in Ouagadougou, a different kind of countdown reached zero. Behind closed doors, under Captain Ibrahim Traoré's direct command, Burkina Faso's National Assembly gathered for an emergency session at dawn. The decree was signed. All oil and gold reserves within Burkina Faso are hereby nationalized and permanently protected from foreign corporate ownership. Licenses held by French and Canadian firms were revoked overnight. AUS survey team was escorted quietly to the border. Contracts that once funneled wealth to Paris and Wall Street were burned away in a single stroke of ink. By sunrise, every foreign company still clinging to Burkinabe soil received the same message. Pack your bags, you are done here. Then, at midday, the nation saw its leader again. No uniform this time, no weapons, just traditional Burkinabe cloth and a voice steady as the desert wind. We have been exploited for generations. He said, now that we find our wealth, they want to take it back. But I am not here to serve empires. I am here to serve a people who have suffered too long. Burkina Faso is not afraid, and I will not negotiate with thieves. The reaction was thunderous across Ouagadougou. Crowds filled the streets, chanting and drumming. Fireworks lit the sky. In village courtyards, elders wept as radios crackled with his words. Young men held up jars of oil, handfuls of soil, coins of gold, whispering the same phrase, we protect what's ours. Online, the moment caught fire. A short 43-second video Traoré looking into the camera, declaring, this is not just about oil. This is not just about gold. This is about the soul of Africa, and I would rather die standing than live kneeling. Within 48 hours, it was reposted 12 million times. Hashtags surged. Number Africa is not for sale. Number New Africa. Number Burkina Faso latest news. Former presidents who had long remained silent broke their quiet, one after another. They called this young captain the start of a new era. Across the continent, murals went up, songs were written, sermons were preached. In Harlem and Atlanta, in Lagos and Johannesburg, the same refrain echoed, Africa can do it. For the first time in decades, Africa news was not about famine, war, or dependency. It was about dignity. It was about a continent daring to claim ownership of its destiny. The spirit of Sankara returned. Ibrahim Traoré, Sankara whispered in the same breath, as if history itself was watching. But even as the celebrations roared, the stakes grew higher. Trump fumed. The State Department whispered of retaliation. Sanctions were drafted. Bevan. Naval ships repositioned in the Gulf of Guinea. Smear campaigns multiplied. Yet the fear that once paralyzed Africa began to break. In Bamako, tens of thousands marched with banners. If you touch Burkina Faso, you touch us all. In Nairobi, students painted on walls, it's time for Africa. In Lagos, protests outside the U.S. Embassy grew into warnings. Keep your democracy, we'll keep our dignity. And in every corner of the diaspora, from London to Kingston, elders nodded through tears. A small country had stood against empire and survived. The message was clear. This was not just a national decree, it was a continental manifesto. The empire demanded 60%. Africa answered with 100% resistance. If you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say Amen in the comments below. Because what rose in Burkina Faso that week was not only a nation defending itself, it was a fire that carried the promise of Pan-African unity, the weight of African sovereignty, and the dream our ancestors prayed would one day come true. The world expected submission. Instead, it witnessed defiance. What began as a single line in a classified cable became a declaration written in the soil of Africa. Donald Trump's ultimatum demanded 60% of a nation's soul, but President Ibrahim Traoré answered with 100% resistance. This was more than politics. This was prophecy fulfilled. The son of Ouagadougou stood where Sankara once stood and declared that freedom is not a gift from empire, but a birthright of the people. It reminded us that Pan-Africanism is not dead theory in dusty books. It is alive in the AES shield, in the voices of youth painting murals, in the elders whispering, "Our children will not bow again." It reminded us that African sovereignty is not a dream, it is a choice. And this choice, once made, cannot be undone. The West called him reckless, but the people called him something greater: leader, brother, symbol. From the Sahel crossroads to the streets of New York, the cry was the same: Africa is not for sale. And in that cry, Africa discovered its voice again. So we must ask ourselves, would our ancestors be proud to see this moment? Would they see in Traoré's stand the answer to their prayers? And what story will we tell our children, that we bowed once more, or that we rose when the world told us to kneel? If this story moved something in your chest, don't scroll past. Like, share, speak, subscribe.